Gather round, hunters, and welcome back to another episode of Starfleet Command. Orion Pirates, Admiral Tarek of the heavy battle cruiser Ancient Kings, as we continue our campaign against the Romulan Star Empire. And unfortunately, the audio quality in this episode went completely, terribly, horrifically bad. I don't even know what happened, because when I tried recording a couple of samples afterwards, everything seemed absolutely fine, and yet the mic continued to freak out every single bit throughout this entire episode. And because of that, well, we lost the episode. All that remains, unfortunately, is the image. So what I'm going to do is what I've done previously when this happens on occasion, is I'm going to voice over what happened from sort of an armchair rewatching of what goes on. So hopefully we can all have a bit of a good time with that. After all, the game is a ton of fun, even if I'm just commentating on it after the fact. So one of the main things we wanted to look at in this episode was we wanted to test out new salvo options, because we have a lot of MIRVs at this point. We have 6 MIRV launchers. Each one of those MIRVs becomes 6 more missiles. So we have 36 missiles plus an additional 8 missiles of standard style missiles. That's an absolute metric ton of firepower. Now, when we were in our battleship, we didn't really have enough firepower in our MIRVs alone to get an enemy captain to consider this to be enough of a threat to stop. And because of that, well, we ended up just tossing entire full salvos at people, or we end up grabbing the quad B rack that we had on the bow of the ship and tossing that in as well. Now, it wasn't ideal, it wasn't fantastic, but it was what we had to work with. Well, now that we've got 2 triple launchers, we probably have enough to actually cause the enemy captain to freak out. 3 missiles might be enough for the captain to believe that he is under so much threat that he needs to do something about it. And so we endeavored to try this out. Now, Sean McNamara, I believe, was the one who brought this idea up in a previous episode. He wrote an excellent write-up of what he thought our tactics using our missiles going forward was, and so we decided we were going to test that a little bit more. And that was why we started opening fire with just 3 missiles. Now, what we're going to learn by doing this is that this works. This works astonishingly well. I haven't come into a ship yet who is able to just take it and ignore it. That's not true. We ran into one ship in this episode who was able to mostly ignore this entire massive salvo. The other thing we wanted to figure out was what sort of distance do we need between the initial missile volley and the follow-up missile volley, so as to create the shortest amount of time between the distraction and the main punch. We kind of were thinking about it. I started with a distance of about 15, and then I started bringing it in. By the end of the episode, we came down to a range of about 12, and that was as close as I kind of felt comfortable dealing with. And the reason for that was that's half a turn. That ought to give more than enough time for the Wild Weasel to be fully deleted, and that'll allow the rest of the missiles to follow up. This would work out pretty decently well. I haven't been timing it super accurately because we started to get into a whole bunch of other things at the time, but yeah, things were not going bad at all. We got a whole bunch of good missile strikes, and really, it just became a matter of the initial salvo of 3, and then the follow-up salvo of 44. Well, I suppose if we were going by that math, it would be the initial salvo of 18 and the follow-up of 44. So enough missile firepower that pretty much nobody's really gonna be able to deal with that. At least that was the thinking. So after we went up north, we initially wanted to retake control of our supply lines. One of the areas up north had been cut. We jumped up to it, we grabbed it real quick, took it back under control, because we're not really certain sort of what the interaction between losing control of something and being able to capture more territories moving down. I didn't want to suddenly find myself in a situation where I couldn't damage any of the Romulan planets or sectors because we weren't somehow connected back to home. I don't think it works that way. Most of me is pretty convinced that that's not how that happens, but I just wanted to be sure, and I didn't want to suddenly find myself in a position where the Gorn would take the territory and suddenly we couldn't do anything about it. That would just be terrible. So that was the thinking. On our way back down south, because we wanted to start hitting Romulan planets and open territories, we got picked up by a diplomat. He decided that he wanted to be escorted into battle by a battle cruiser, and we had to oblige. I made some pithy comment about going into a battleship instead, but at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter all that much. The diplomatic delivery mission is not all that difficult. You generally run into something that's around your size or a little bit less. And if you absolutely desperately must, you can just avoid it. There's one of the reasons why I almost never do this mission in reverse, because there is a mission type that is literally the opposite of this, where the enemy is trying to deliver the diplomat to the planet, and you have to intercept him in time. I think we've done it twice, maybe 3 times, throughout all 12 seasons of the Starfleet Command, and most of those times they just sprinted right on by, went to the planet, delivered, and we lost. There was no way to try and mitigate that. I do think, though, once we were able to stop them by grabbing onto them and just laying into them with everything we had, and it worked out. That might have been during the stream. So here we are again. We're going to be testing the triple Merv shot followed up by the monster salvo, and at this point we're trying to count what sort of range we need to be looking at. I was looking at one of the back missiles and trying to figure out what I would feel comfortable with, and that's what I noticed. If you look at the MFD, if you wait just a little bit longer, then you can fire the entire salvo all over again, because the original plan was going to be fire 3, wait, fire 3, fire 8. So the idea would be fire your first 3 Mervs, you let it get out half a turn ahead of you, then you fire your second 3 Mervs, and then just behind them you fire the full-on normal missile salvo. Well, we found if we waited this time period, we didn't have to do that. We could just fire 3, wait the full turn while keeping up with the missile. If we do a speed of 12, then we're going to be at half a turn away from how far the missiles are going to be traveling. And then you just fire the entire salvo again. So that works out a lot better if you're trying to saturate a target. Now, against something like this Alphabet Soup Heavy War Destroyer, it's not going to make much of a difference. He never stood a chance to begin with. The amount of firepower he brought to the table, I believe, was 8 Phaser X's, which were pretty decently dangerous, and 2 Plasma S's. So nothing horrific. You can see the Mervs were able to cut right through his forward shields. He did turn to bring his other shields around, which did buy him some time, but in the end, those heavy missiles, each dealing 24 damage, just too much in a single spike, and annihilated him. So we went to green alert, we kicked up the speed time, rushed right on into the planet to drop him off. A rather cold, tundra-looking planet, not a place that you particularly would want to go, so clearly this diplomat managed to annoy somebody and has been thrown out to the back end of Beyond. So sad for him. And somewhat so sad for us, because we had to deliver him, and no doubt he was in a right terrible mood this entire time. Not that I can really blame him. After all, would you be in a grand mood if you were being dropped off here? I think not. So lots of craters. It looks more like a moon than anything else, as we cruised on in relatively slowly. I'm always a little bit paranoid about smashing into planets, and I have good reason to. In the last Merak campaign, I think it's season 4, it might be 3, but I think it's 4, we actually took our, not brand new, but it had been our solid carrier. We had been rolling in a Merak carrier for pretty much a decent portion of that campaign up to that point, and it was on a diplomatic delivery, and we sort of lost attention. We stopped paying attention. Things got away from us, and we smashed the entire carrier into the planet. It was rather embarrassing. And because of that, we had to start from way back. It was unfortunate, to say the least. So I always am a little bit paranoid when it comes to driving towards planets. A quick patrol came up next. We were escorted by a single tiny Federation drone destroyer who would attempt to get into battle and fail. He's actually going to try as hard as he can to have some sort of impact on this fight, and before he can do really anything, we managed to steal his glory from him, which was quite amusing to us. As you can see, he's accelerated. He's going hard. I actually thought I was at too high of a game speed because of how fast this guy was accelerating. I was like, wait a second, are we still playing on 7? And turns out we were. But yeah, we ran into one of these Firehawks who, if I'm not mistaken, this was 2 Fs and no supplementary plasma torpedoes, because this will end up being a pseudo-frigate tender. So the FFHKX has 2 or 4 pseudo-frigates on top of it. They never got into range to have any real effect, so I didn't really pay too much attention to that. But yeah, he only had 2 R-type plasma torpedoes. I thought at first he was a fast Firehawk, because FFH, it kind of made sense to me. And then when he deployed his pseudo-frigates afterwards, it was a little bit more concerning. Had he been able to get those pseudo-frigates into range, had he been able to do something with them, he would have been much, much more dangerous. Unfortunately, it would not be. as you can see, we were able to just bring so much fire out to the table. And we dropped back in speed here deliberately because we wanted to get that extension going out. We were starting to really formulate that sort of half-turn difference by just waiting the full turn at half speed would work out pretty decently. Also, one of the great things about the missile launcher placement on this ship is the fact that the MIRVs are up front. They do not have to travel the entire length of the ship, which was a huge problem on the battleship. You wouldn't think it'd be a big problem, but after playing through it, you could wait as much as a turn before the missiles would actually get in front of the ship, so that you could then launch the rest of your missiles on top of it. It actually turned out to be one of the biggest problems we had throughout the entire campaign. Well, not the entire campaign, after all, we're still playing the campaign, but throughout the battleship phase of the campaign, I've actually thought about reinvesting and buying more battleships. We're almost at that cash level. But at the end of the day, it just makes more sense if we do end up enlarging the fleet, which we might. I don't really feel any need to, mainly because once you start enlarging the fleet, you got to trust the AI with assets that you've bought. And that becomes very dicey very quickly. And here comes the Antares. He's trying to help out. And no. 6 wasted missiles. Sorry, Antares. You tried. You really did. I got to give you credit for it, but at the end, you couldn't have an effect on the battle. Yeah, I kind of want to keep the fleet small, just because it's easier to work with, it's easier to manage. If you have to start managing the AI does really dumb things. You end up having to set them on manual control if you want them to actually be intelligent about firing, because you're taking over the firing. So if we wanted to do that, it would be a whole ton of extra work just to keep track of them. And even then, they don't really react in a way that I would consider the right way to respond, especially against plasma-armed races. If we were fighting, like, Lyrans, I wouldn't feel so bad about it. I'd probably keep them in tight formation and keep us at range at that point. But against the Romulans can be really, really difficult if you're not ready to handle them. And the AI, frankly, isn't. So if we were to fight Romulans with an entire fleet at our back, somebody would get too close, then they'd get fired on, then they'd crash stop, then they'd get ganged up on and die, and that's how most plasma battles end. Which is why one of the main reasons why I end up saying that a plasma fight really boils down to how many people did you bring? More than the enemy, you won. Fewer than the enemy, you lost. Now that's not true once you throw the player into the mix, but for the AI, I firmly believe that. So we had 2 more Hawks in this one, and I was actually thinking that this guy might be a Mauler because he's FHMX, but that would turn out not to be the case. The fitting on that FHMX is pretty fascinating. We also had a Super Hawk we had to deal with, but the Super Hawk I wasn't super concerned about. He's very vanilla in the way that he's designed, and not designed to be able to handle the Marek. But this guy, he's got 4 D-type plasma torpedoes on board. That's a fantastic escort, really. That's the kind of escort you'd bring with a King Condor, because at that point, if you brought 2 of these FHMXs along with a single King Condor, you're looking at 12 D-type plasma torpedoes. Nobody's getting through that. Our missiles salvo of 44 missiles might make it through that, but it would be difficult. At some point, I'm going to have to actually test that. There is actually a couple of light cruisers and destroyers in the Romulan forces that actually have the 4 D-type plasma torpedo loadout. I'm going to actually have to send myself up against 3 of those things in skirmish mode just to see if they can handle them. We were also taking time to admire the USS Stephens because it is a gorgeous design. It does have the swept forward hull saucer section, I suppose, the arrowhead saucer section, which was kind of the thinking, I believe, in Starfleet battles, that you would have different saucer sections for different roles. I could be wrong on that, but it really feels like that would make a lot of sense, given that all of the fast ships, quote unquote, have the swept saucer, which does look kind of cool. Although, I really do like the circular saucer. We're also being escorted by a Federation heavy bombardment, or heavy cruiser advanced type, which is really cool. Oh yeah, he survived, which had me all kinds of panicking at this point. I'm like, oh, now I've got to get through it. And then the Pollux just came in with the heavy photon torpedoes, like, gone. So that was absolutely lovely. The Pollux would actually end up doing a surprising amount of damage in this battle. He wasn't just sitting there doing nothing. He was quite useful. Also, there's a little glitch here that we've noticed before, but it really becomes a lot more noticeable once you start playing with a lot more MIRVs. MIRVs seem to ignore all homing systems and homing defense systems. So the Romulan here cloaks. The Amanus goes into cloak. He tries to avoid incoming damage, and you'll notice that the surviving MIRVs they don't go away. And the MIRVs that we launched just here in this big cloud, they didn't go away. So the question becomes, are MIRVs affected by anything? Aside from being shot down, and obviously wild weasels, but when it comes to cloak, they ignore it. They just go right for the target every single time. Now, they only deal 1/6 of the damage of a normal missile, so each one is only worth 4. And cloaking gives you a massive amount of damage reduction. But still, that's a pretty deadly combination that you can add. I would almost say that picking a ship like a heavy bombardment cruiser in a multiplayer match against a Romulan vessel is probably unfair, just because he can't use his cloak against the MIRVs. And honestly, he should be able to use his cloaks against the MIRV. That's kind of half the reason that cloaking exists. So we were able to quite easily delete that XCA, but we found out we were low on ammo. At this point, we had run one MIRV launcher dry. We were down to 3 salvos on the other one. We had, I believe, 5 salvos left in our B racks, and the C rack was also pretty low at this point. So we were just sort of running things down. We were trying to get set up on a bearing here that would take us directly into a shield instead of straddling between two, because one of the more effective emergency defensive maneuvers you can do, if you can put your enemy on a corner of a shield, the fire is going to get spread between the 2 shields. So that can make things a little bit easier on you. This game has surprisingly accurate positional data when it comes from where you're shooting from to where you're shooting to, because depending on where the weapon's position on the ship is, will determine which shield it will hit. So that can become very important, especially on large targets like this, where it can feel very, very random at that point. So just a little something to keep in mind if you're ever going up against a planet, or if you're ever fighting against somebody and you find yourself in a situation where you need to just shave off a little bit more, put the corner on. The corner will protect you. Now, on the flip side of this, if you are playing ISC, the corner is your friend, because the corner does the most amount of concentrated damage from your PPDs. PPDs do a great amount of damage anyway, but if you hit on a corner, instead of having to divide between all 3 shields, and it prioritizes the center, but then the sides get shifted a bit. Instead, it just divides it in half. And one side, I think it's the starboard side, gets favored in that situation. I'm not entirely sure, but one side does get favored in terms of damage. But it will actually increase the damage moreover. Actually, no, it looks like the port side is favored in damage. I'm looking at the little Empire at War pamphlet fold-out thing that came with the game. And if you're at a range of 11 to 15, it's 3 plus 2 instead of 1 plus 3 plus 1. So I think I guess it favors the port side, or maybe not, but it will favor one side over the other. But still, that's the best way to get the most amount of damage in a single target. So that was the Steffens firing his salvo. Did a pretty good job, and our initial salvo was coming in, and then the Pollux came into play, and the Pollux just shattered that shield, which was fantastic. It allowed us to get right on in through. We didn't have to worry about having to punch through the shield itself. All we had to worry about was the point defense system, which picked up a couple of missiles and picked off a couple more. So he's holding on a couple of MIRVs and then a couple more missiles with his tractor beams, but his point defense system was mostly ineffective. At this point, we're out of MIRVs. We've used them all up, so now we're just down to normal missiles and disruptors, which we start getting involved with, plinking away. We're not expecting the disruptors to really do too much. What we're hoping the disruptors will do is stun a system for a little while. Oh, and this was fun. The Plasma S torpedo came in off the starboard side, but because the planet is so big and the launcher is located over on that end of the planet, it's got to travel all the way to you, which, because the planet's so huge, it has no power by the time it gets there. We actually went through our defensive systems, right here, and we flickered through just to make sure that we weren't going to waste any phaser firepower on it, because at that point, the shields are going to be able to handle it no problem at all. So we just commenced the bombardment. I kind of wanted to run the launchers dry just thematically, because it was amusing to me. But we sat here just blasting away, which is something the heavy bombardment cruiser, as you might have guessed from its name, or I suppose for the Marak, it's the advanced bombardment cruiser. It's really good at this, as long as you have ammunition. The moment we run dry on missiles, our firepower drops pretty heavily. Comparatively to a Marak battleship, we're actually fine. Like, if you compare an advanced bombardment cruiser to a standard Marak BBM, we've got more firepower in every single regard. We equal him on disruptors, we have more power that we can output with phasers, and we actually have more missile launchers in terms of total tubes by 2. And that doesn't even count the fact that our MIRVs, well, it's 36 MIRVs versus 12. So there's a little bit of a difference in firepower. The difference is the battleship, of course, has better armor. If we were to just start pounding into a battleship, that armor would last much longer than ours. The Advanced Bombardment Cruiser would have to suffer a little bit with that. And also, the Advanced Bombardment Cruiser can't make it to a speed of 31 while having all weapons on. Unless you turn off a couple of your disruptors, you can't actually make it to full speed, which is a bit of a problem. It's not huge, but honestly, I would be more than willing to swap out 4 of those disruptors for another 2 or 4 phaser arrays if I could, just because of that reason, so that I could get more speed out of the ship. Speed is, on a certain level, very important in these sorts of heavy cruisers. And yeah, they can get a lot of work done. It's actually a major problem in the Federation one. It also can't make full speed, but it just has so many weapons, it almost doesn't matter. We've got to look for a BBMX. That might be something worth investing in for our AI buddies, because how much trouble could they get in with a battleship? Then again, it would send much, much larger opponents against us, so that may actually be a pretty terrible idea. So our Marines are just about to finish taking control of the planet. Everything went by the numbers. We made a pretty decent amount of prestige, 670 if I remember correctly, and everything went out really gosh darn well. I can't complain about how this episode went at all. We managed to annihilate pretty much everything that we wanted to. So I'm going to wrap things up here. I've been Tirak. If you like what you've been seeing, hit that like button and subscribe. If you want to receive notifications every time I list one of these videos, press that little bell icon. Leave a comment. Did you like this episode? I know the post-commentary is not nearly as fun, in my opinion, as being right there with it, but I hope this was a good enough thing to sort of tide you guys over until tomorrow, which will be a Rogue Tech episode. Anyway, I will see you all in the next episode.